In this week's Talking D&D, I'm talking to Daniel Bode from Relaxed Fantasy Review. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Chris. How you doing?
Hi. So we've decided 3 ways to create characters is our discussion, and I know you've got 3 topics. We've spoke about that. So now let's open up with the role-playing way.
Yeah, I think that based on my experience in the D&D space, this tends to be everyone's introduction to D&D. When a person first hears about the game, they immediately start thinking about video games, or they think about fantasy movies, Lord of the Rings, or other things of that nature. And they think, ooh, it would be really cool to play like my character from Skyrim, or to play Link from Legend of Zelda, or to play Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. They have an idea. Yeah. And these character concepts are what they stem from. And that was what I initially built my channel around, was the idea that people who've never played the game before, they don't know the difference between a sorcerer and a wizard, or a fighter and a paladin. They don't know. So let's start them off with something that they do know. Tell me what your character is in your mind. And by doing that, they start off with a concept. And then they take that concept and they're like, well, should I be a fighter or should I be a ranger? And then you're like, well, which one's Aragorn? Well, does Aragorn ever use magic? Debatably. Does Aragorn wear heavy armor? Sometimes. It depends. And, you can start using questions like that with your players, or just as an individual, to say, okay, well, based on these things, based on these questions that I would ask myself, that helps me determine that Aragorn is, in fact, a fighter, not a ranger, at least in D&D terms. In the Lord of the Rings universe, they refer to him as the ranger, but he definitely fits the fighter as a better archetype. So you'd start with that concept, and then you build your character from there. Well, I want to be a fighter. Here are my subclass options. Which one fits my fantasy the best? And here are my weapon options. Here's my armor option. What are the things that work for me? And you don't build your character optimized. You build them to meet the goals of the fantasy the most. And I think that's the healthiest place to start in D&D as a brand new player.
Yeah, I agree with that. Familiarization of Aragorn, for example, you immediately picture the whole package, don't you, as a new player? You know how they act. Or for a better example would be Legolas. I want to jump off that wall, run on the orc's head, and that is a template. Yeah, I agree. That's good. But then, would you think that for a new player, they don't need to fill in all the backstory and the flaws? You just go, you're Aragorn, you hit with that sword.
Yep, and as they start to become more familiar with the building blocks of the game, because like you said, Legolas wants to run over something and jump on the orc's back, and you're like, okay, well, make an acrobatics check then. If they fail it, then they're gonna fall off the orc or the ogre or whatever. And in doing so, that's gonna teach them that the fantasy still is relying on the engine of a game. You're still playing a game and you can still lose. Unlike your fantasy, because most people don't lose in their own head. Most people, when they're fantasizing about being an elf or a hero or whatever, they don't think about the times that they slip and fall. They don't think about the missed attacks. They don't think about the times they get knocked unconscious and have to be healed. That's not part of the fantasy. So integrating that is important, because I think a lot of players, when they start playing the game, they'll miss with their first attack. And they're like, wait a sec, why did I miss? Well, you rolled low. Oh, well, that's boring. And you have to get over that hump first. And keeping someone engaged with the concept of role playing, the concept of, well, maybe you didn't miss. Maybe your enemy was just skilled enough to block your attack. Or maybe you did hit, but you weren't expecting their armor to be that thick. So giving them some more role play, using role play as a bridge between the imagination, where you can't lose, and D&D, where you can definitely lose. That is a very, very key part of a player's journey. And the DM needs to be aware of that and know not to go too hard on these folks and to make that role play a little more spicy, a little more fun for them there in the beginner.
Yeah, I would say if you're Legolas, for example, and you shoot and miss, that is unbelievable. So I would rather say, I don't say you miss. I'm like, you hit, you just didn't get something, an artery. You know, it's lodged in his armor chink because you're not going to miss. So maybe like that. Or when you're hitting something huge and it's like, it's a giant, you're not going to miss. But stabbing a giant in the big toe, maybe it doesn't damage him and by the way you're expecting. So yeah, it's a matter of phrasing it, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. For those that's why I talk about character creation as the role play, where you are not so concerned with having the best strength or the best dexterity based on your weapon choice. I've had players before who were like, oh, I want to be a wizard because I want to use arcane magic and hold a spell book and I want to be like, Dumbledore or whatever. Cool. Yeah, but I really don't want to be that smart. Like I want to have like a low intelligence and a high charisma instead. I'm like, okay, well, how about we talk about some spells you could choose that don't necessarily need a high modifier? Because that's a way you can build a character. You can build it so that it's built around a different mechanic. Magic missile, for example. It doesn't matter what your intelligence is. You just fire it, it hits, it does damage. Things like disguise self, that's a spell that doesn't require any sort of roll on your part. It simply does its thing. There's a lot of ways that you can build a character without min-maxing their stats, and they're just like, yeah, I want to be more charming, less smart, not particularly dexterous, but kind of tanky. And you're like, you're not really describing a wizard, but let's make it work. And you make it work. That's the whole point.
Yeah, you should be able to design every possible combination, but I think it's agreed that some things work and some things don't. My son's, the Sawlock, he's a sorcerer, warlock. Apparently that's a good build. My barbarian wizard just doesn't fit the mold. I'm like, but wizards are weak, so let's make a strong wizard. Don't stop me making a strong wizard. I know that the rages and the spellcat and everything mishmashes, but I do not have any template that I can't use. I will play anybody just because I'd have no bias. I don't look at rangers as boring. I don't look at fighters as button mashing. I will play anything, and I can't be the only one. And I think if you want to play that, you play that, and just
make it work.
Yeah, make it work.
So, I love that comment you just made where you said, you should be able to play anything, because that's going to get into the final piece of this puzzle. But we'll save that for the randomization bit, because I actually have a lot to say about that one.
Okay. Well, you were talking there about simplifying it for new people. I would say, because when you've got spell casting, I'd be like, look, you can cast Magic Missile, you can cast Cure Wounds, you've got heal, and you can hit with that sword. And essentially, you've just created a video game character there. It's like, what are you going to do? Magic Missile him, or you're going to, just to start with, because everything's got these trees, what descend into further subcategories of trees, and you really need to have a player base. Right now, your Magic Missile can actually do 4 darts, and they're like, oh, this is cool. Now, you can swap this out for Scorching Ray with something, let's just say. What is like similar but different. Burning Hands, these things fire from your hands. So yeah, it's step by step, isn't it? A new player is just like, well, here's the player's handbook. Here's all the subclasses you could possibly play. No, who wants that?
No. When you hand a person this book, when they look at this, look how many pages in this thing. There's so much in here that I hate it when DMs do that. When a friend of theirs says, oh, I want to learn to play D&D, and they're like, here, read this book. Like, never mind. And that's off-putting. That's not the attitude I want to take, because there's so much information in there that you don't need to know, at least not to start. There's lots of little nuances in the mechanics. I'll admit that as a player, I didn't read the entire player's handbook. I played a rogue for almost 2 months when I first started playing 5th edition, before realizing that I could bonus action attack with light weapons. I didn't know. Yeah. I was over here just hitting once. If I missed my sneak attack, I missed my sneak attack. But I didn't know that you could bonus action attack no matter what your class told you could do, because that was just a baked-in mechanic. I had to read and find that out. My DM also didn't know about that mechanic. He was also new to the game, and when I found it and we read over it, he was like, oh, you could have been like doing twice as much damage almost. I'm like, yeah. No wonder my felt a little underwhelming. I wasn't playing it right. But anyway, so yeah, role playing and using character inspiration and really telling the story more than just crunching the numbers. That's one way to build your character, and I think the most beginner friendly way.
Yeah. So the next step is optimizing your characters.
This is one of those things that I see. One of my favorite YouTube channels, this is a bigger D&D channel, D4 D&D Deep Dive. You ever watch that guy?
No.
His name's Colby. He's one of those guys who puts out like an hour-long video once a week where he does a build. He comes up with one specific idea, whether it's a class or it's a weapon or it's a feat or something, and he builds an entire character starting at level 1, and then he goes all the way to level 17, building the character and going over every step of how to do it. He also has one of those voices that's very ASMR friendly, so you can very easily fall asleep to him. But he goes into great detail. He min-maxes his characters all the time, talking about like, let's max out our ability scores. He'll have a 20 in something and an 8 in something else. He's always going for the feats, and he actually will sit using spreadsheets. He calls himself a slave to the spreadsheet, and crunches the numbers at certain levels along the way to see how much damage you're doing. Or if you're doing a tank build, how much damage you can take based on different kinds of encounter. Or in some of the healer builds he's done, how many hit points you can put into the party per rest if you're just burning all your resources doing that. It's very much a kind of, I want my character to do one thing and be the absolute best at it they can be. And I think that's a little more of an advanced form of building. The classic example, which a lot is talked about a lot in the D&D space, is the Great Weapon Master Polearm Master builds, where you are maximizing your attacks. You take a class that does a lot of attacks, and each one you take your -5 penalty, and your bonus action is weaponized, and if you take the Sentinel feat, your reaction is weaponized, and you just want to put out as many numbers as possible. And that, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a beautiful way to build characters. And the problem is that it takes the heart and soul out of the character just a little bit. So the reason I talked about optimization being the starting point is because once you've done your math, once you have picked your feats, picked your stats, and you can now do that one thing really, really well, then is the time to start diving in to character. Why can your character do this?
Yeah.
If their racial background is inspired by this, let's say that they're a tank build and they're like a half orc or something else that has the relentless endurance feature, for example. Well, is their need to protect others based on something that happens with their orc tribe? Are they the last of them? Do they have the regrets that is related to the fact they couldn't save their family in the past? Or, you take the mechanic and then you build a story out of that. Because if anyone, you can think about this in the real world too. If anyone is the best at something, if they're driven to just constantly be really, really good at something, why? What happened to them to drive them to that sort of thing? What kind of person are they that they want to be the master of something, leaving all other skills by the wayside? What was the cause? And I think that is a wonderful way for someone who is very familiar with D&D to build those deeper characters that don't necessarily start from a role-playing perspective. It's like the role play comes second.
I know when the slight times that I get to play, I'm quite a big role player. I quite like doing the talking in between. And I generally befriend the healer of the group because I know that's going to come in useful. I don't necessarily take the heals because I want to be hitting things. But yeah, I'm like, my character, me and you are best friends, and I've got your back and you've got mine, right? That's what I'm like. So it's like an extended optimization tool of or I will, if I can, me and you will both, I'm going to say flat-footed because I'm playing Pathfinder at the moment. We'll flank enemies. That's the plan. That is our A game. And that really works. So you can even extend that to you take that, I'll take this optimizing, can't you? Outside of yourself.
Right.
But yeah, I think my players are the type to reduce things just so they can extend others higher. I think that is the kind of players I have at home. So yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That type of play is incredibly rewarding because, it's those players that have the epic moments. Whether it's the epic succeeds because you got yourself a paladin with a 20 charisma and a 20 strength at the high levels of play, and they, double or triple attack and hit with high level smites and one shot the demon lord. That's an epic moment.
Yeah.
But then you've got, the barbarian over here who is tanking dragon's breath and, just not dying. And then a spellcaster comes along and hits them with a simple suggestion spell, and their wisdom save has got a -1 on it. These epic moments of success and failure are what make the game so memorable. In fact, I will honestly say that my memorable moments in D&D come more from my failures than from my successes. It's my epic losses that I actually remember more because, you slap your forehead and you're just like, oh man. And then the DM either, you wake up in prison stripped of your gear with a hit point left and you're like, oh man, so I don't have to roll a new character? Or you do. And then it's like, well, I guess I got to roll a replacement now. There's a fun story. I see this one in the meme section a lot in the D&D groups, is where like an 11-year-old kid's playing D&D for the first time. He's a badass warrior, and then he ends up getting killed. And then the encounter's over, and the DM looks at the 11-year-old player, and he's like, I guess you're going to have to make a new character. And the kid's just sitting there, and he grabs a pencil and writes Junior next to his character's name, slaps it down and says, I am such and such Junior, and I'm here to avenge my father. And that's just, if that happened at my table, I would literally stand up and cheer. Like, that's just a great moment that you would never forget. And that's why it made an amazing meme.
Yeah. So, the way that optimizations work is that it makes you, if you're the healer, you're going to heal well. If you're the rogue, you're going to be a rogue well. And I think that's why the optimization is the most popular way, because you don't want to be the Legolas we described who misses and doesn't do the things that he does. On Saturday, I played, our healer tried to heal a party member, and in Pathfinder was actually hurting him and driving his death saves up through the roof. And yet I came along, I'll just roll, and I got him back on his feet. Makes no sense that our healer was killing him by accident. He had terrible rolls. With optimized characters, that is so unlikely to happen because your stats are so high. Can happen, but shouldn't.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. I got into a discussion, another YouTube channel, D&D Shorts. You know him? Yeah,
of course.
Fantastic guy. Love him. I'm in his Discord group, and I was having a chat with another DM, and there's a DM chat room in there. We were talking about if you make builds, there is ways for your stats not to even matter. We had this idea where we were like, how many different abilities throughout like the D&D classes and subclasses and such add dice to your rolls? And we were like, well, there's Bless, the cleric spell, which adds a d4 to all of your rolls. And then there's the cleric, the Peace Domain Cleric's Emboldening Bond does that with another d4. And those two actually can stack, so you can have 2 d4. Then there's the Divine Soul Sorcerer. Once per short rest, they can add 2 d4 to something. And we started going through, and we started realizing that a character who had a 10 in strength or dex, using an attack, but had all of these buffs on their back would actually be more likely to hit than a character who had a 20 in the stat, but none of the buff.
All right.
It was a weird math thing we were doing, but we ended up seeing that, like, yeah, obviously that's a crazy character. You need a little bit of sorcerer, a little bit of cleric. Your stats are all kind of weird. But they don't really matter if you build something to have every buff possible, it just starts to get into insane levels. The same way that you talk about like armor artificers who've got like heavy armor proficiency, the shield spell, or I guess blade singer wizards, same concept. You can just stack your AC to the stratosphere so that nothing can even possibly hit you as long as you're spending all your resources on that. So yeah, there's definitely ways to build for that insane, like almost unbeatable optimization in one specific thing.
Yeah, as a DM, I don't like the fact that they're running around and I can't hit them. It's like, why? I don't always roll great, and so it's like, come on, this is boring.
That's moments when that's one of those moments where you don't lean into your dice rolls. Like the last time I was playing a low level campaign, I was playing the Sunless Citadel. You ever play that one?
No, I've read it.
Yeah, I'm playing that right now it's only a 2-person party. So I actually let them start at level 3 instead of level 1 so that they have a little more of an edge. And they at one point have to go up against a dragon. It's a wormling dragon, but it's still a dragon. And both of them had reasonably high AC. So, but I determined that a dragon's a pretty intelligent creature. It's not your standard, giant rat or goblin. So I'm like, okay, so it's going to look at them. It's going to see that they're both, wearing heavy armor. It's probably not going to try to hit them with its claws or bite. It's probably going to use its breath weapon primarily. So, like in my head, obviously it depends on what creature you're running and such, but the idea that yes, the artificer, the wizard, the paladin, they can crank their AC to ridiculous spots, but then you hit them with something that requires like a dex save. What's a paladin going to do against the dex save? There are always options to get through that, but I still think it's fair to let your players have their moment in the sun when they are just unhittable. There's 10 goblins surrounding them and everything's trying to hit them, and they're like, my AC is 25, so you can't touch me, and that's great. The great.
Yeah. The players come first, and if my monsters are rolling bad, I don't fudge the rolls. I'm like, this is your fight. This is your day. They are the heroes, but sometimes there's a pressure to give them an interesting final fight rather than a walk in the park.
That actually brings me. I have a question for you. You just said you don't fudge the rolls if the monsters are rolling low. Tell me the truth, and you don't have to give the examples if you want to, but I'm very curious. Have you ever fudged rolls to avoid a TPK?
Yes.
I think every DM has.
Yeah, because that's the worst nightmare, isn't it? I mean, I start getting worried. I'm like, okay, I like a kill, and I like 2 kills and a maim. But if you've got just one guy left, it's like, oh, come on, this is the end. We have a bit of a rule where we can re-roll characters all day long, but if everyone's wiped out, we walk away. And when you spent months in the campaign and you do that, as we did in Tomb of Annihilation, I was like, there's only so many times it makes sense for the story for more and more of us to. You don't have the knowledge for all the 9 months or 8 months, so.
And then Tomb of Annihilation is just kind of built like that, though. That's what that's for. But yeah, no, I've definitely had moments. I had one not that long ago, actually, where a wizard was the last man standing. It was not a great place to be, and he got killed, and he got killed, and all the party were just sitting there, and they were like, "Oh crap, we lost. Everyone's dead." And then I let it sit for a minute, and then I told the wizard player, the next thing you see is red in your eyes, and you're coughing and you're spluttering because they were just knocked unconscious, and the enemies left the room. And then his familiar, who hadn't been part of the ran over and force-fed him a healing potion. And it was enough, and it was in enough time that he was able to pull out another one and give it to the other party members, so they were able to save it. And I was like, if your familiar had been part of the fight, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But I'm always looking. I don't necessarily botch the rolls, but I'm always looking for a way, a deus ex machina, if you will, to save the party if the worst should happen. And I always have kind of that in the back of my mind. If the worst should happen, how do I save the players? And there's usually a way.
I balance it out. If I do a bit of, if I'm doing I'm saving the players when really they would have died. I have one in the bank then to think as the first person who goes down, that monster will attack that dead body for a huge damage. You know, because they're always like, but I'm down. It would, yes, but a lot of monsters will, like bears, will see that you're down and shake you to bits just in case you're going to get back up. Especially when you've got players who do keep getting back up, restored. The monsters will be like, stay down, you know. So it's a bit of a balance. That's story, isn't it?
Absolutely. Not all monsters are mindless beasts, and even the ones that are animals still can understand the concept of why is that one not staying down. Yeah, definitely.
So the third and final way to create a character, randomized role. Explain that.
This is actually the thing I was most excited to talk about, because this is my favorite way to play when I am playing. See, when I'm talking about other players, when I'm talking about players that are in my games or people that are new to the game or whatever, I'm always talking, do you want role play or do you want optimization? Like, those two seem like the option for 99% of the community. But me personally, I love randomization. In my own, like, even when I'm playing video games and such, I'm a big fan of roguelike video games. I don't know if you've ever played games like that before.
Give me an example.
An example would be Slay the Spire, Hades, Enter the Gungeon. Now
yes.
Okay. The idea is that you start at the beginning, you play, and the game randomizes your events, like the dungeon you're in changes, and then you have to grind through, and you probably are going to die. And then you start at the beginning, the game randomizes, but every time you go through, you get some new resources or a little bit of new power, and you get better at it. And then over time, over dozens or even hundreds of playthroughs, eventually you manage to get to the end. But every time you go through, it's different. Every time the game is randomized. Those are my favorite types of games. I love games that do that. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there, and a lot of the time they're indie games, so they have, like, you know, they don't cost a whole lot, and they've got a really cool development team you can talk to. But I love incorporating randomization, and D&D is the way I love to do that. And when I first started getting my books, I was the most excited when I got Xanathar's Guide to Everyday Dead. First of all, obviously some great stuff in here as far as subclasses and spells, and, you know, it was just a really good addition to the game. But it was the part of the book which was intended as a backstory generator that caught my attention the most. It was on page 61, section called "This Is Your Life." That's backwards.
No, it's not. It's fine.
But you can see it. This is your life.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go into the section, what you end up with are tables which tell you things like where you were born and how many siblings you had, what your family life was like, and it even goes into stuff like, well, these are the 13 backgrounds from the player's handbook: acolyte, folk hero, guild artisan, etc. Why did you become that? There's like suggestions in here. I became a guild artisan because I was apprenticed to a master who taught me a business. Or I helped a guild artisan keep a secret and I was taken in as an apprentice. Or I wanted to get away from my home and start a new life, so I ran away and joined the guild. Like, there's different options in here. And eventually, when you get to the very end of the section, there's actually a part which is meant for DMs to build NPCs. And it's got stuff like, well, if you want to build an NPC, there's a table here with the 12 basic classes, so all except for the artificer, on a table. So you roll a D100, 0 through 7 is a barbarian, 0 through 8 through 14 is a bard, etc. And then you've got the 9 races from the player's handbook as well. You've got alignment, etc. And when I saw all these tables, I was like, what would it be like to build an entire character using nothing but these tables? Imagine for a moment, I grab my dice and I roll, and it says, okay, you're going to be a sorcerer. Cool, I'm going to be a sorcerer. But then I roll again, and it tells me, hey, you're going to be a sorcerer, but your background is that you were a sailor.
That's brilliant.
Well, that's interesting. And the idea is that you start with all of these different building blocks. You've got the backgrounds, the races, the classes, the subclass, as well as the backstory generator. And you don't choose anything. You let the game give you thread after thread after thread, or piece after piece. And then once you have written it all down on a character sheet, it doesn't make any sense because it's randomly assorted bits and pieces. It's my job as the player to make it make sense. And that to me is the joy of randomization, because it's one thing to optimize, oh, this build of a fighter with Great Weapon Master, Polearm Master can do 50 damage in a round, but this Sharpshooter Gloomstalker build can do like 60 damage in a round. Sure, that's fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when someone says, here's an Elven Noble with a 12 strength score who's a barbarian, make it work. Okay, and then you have to start digging in and being like, how can this randomly generated character make any sense? Make it make sense. Make it work. And that level of character creation, while there's not that much to talk about, it's simply the chaos of it. It's like when you're a wild magic sorcerer and you roll on the wild magic surge table. You ever had a player do that before?
No.
Yeah, it's one of the craziest tables in all of D&D, the wild magic table, because so many good and bad things can happen. And when you make an entire character based on that kind of chaos, it really ends up being some of the most memorable characters because you have to pour everything into them just to make them function. You have to make them work in ways that optimizers and role players don't. And that leads me to some of my favorite stories. I ended up doing an experiment one time where I designed 4 different characters using this randomizer technique. And the only thing that I told myself I couldn't do was to repeat. So I couldn't have 2 fighters, I couldn't have 2 elves, that sort of thing. And I ended up with a human nature domain cleric, a gnome who was a mastermind rogue, a swords bard dark elf, and an evocation wizard high elf. So those actually kind of made sense. But then their backgrounds were like guild artisan, hermit, and entertainer, and criminal. And with all these weird backgrounds, I had to be like, how do I turn this into a narrative? How do I make this into a legitimate story? And I found threads. I found ways to like, well, if I take this one and I tie it to here, but then this one here gets in the way, so let's explain that away this way. And it almost feels like a project, like an art project, where you got just no foundation, and you're building it all from the literal threads. And yeah, I have done this many times, and it's amazing how you'd think. You mentioned earlier being a barbarian wizard just doesn't quite make sense. Being a barbarian noble who's like a small race and not very strong also doesn't make a lot of sense, yet you can make it work if you just lean into it and tweak it the right way. And I think that randomization is a thing not enough people talk about. Like that those tables are buried away in Xanathar's guide, and not many people talk about them. And I'm like, why not? This is so much fun. I loved it.
I'm 100% on board with that. I think it's a great idea, and that would be something I would definitely do, given the opportunity. Because like I say, I have no boundaries, and I love the fact of having to make it work, because my son does not. Although, to be one credit for him, he recently played a small character in somewhere, I can't remember which one it was, but he took a weapon that he couldn't hold without it being disadvantaged. It was too big for him, and I was like, well played. You know you're at a disadvantage and you're going to be rubbish with it, but you did it for the story. And he really enjoyed that character, so fair play, you know. However, he had a go at me when I made a gnome wizard that the School of Illusion wasn't of evocation or whatever. It was of illusion. I said, no, my way, I'm going to get out of all the situations by creating some sort of illusion that fits the situation. And I found that really exciting, because I'm like, my imagination I can form anything. Whereas you're just going blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? To me, that's, fun. And none of these ideas are wrong. None of these ways are wrong. And they all suit everybody. But sometimes playing outside of your wheelhouse, you might make new discoveries, right?
And that was actually one of the reasons that I love doing it when I'm a player, is that, yes, I can write stories and I can design characters and have to design, worlds and world build. But when I'm playing something, of course I know that there's half a dozen overly powerful builds that I can do. If I want to absolutely wreck shop, I could play a moon druid, or I could play a warlock paladin, a hexblade paladin, or I could just play a diviner wizard, or there's a lot of those overly powerful ones. But how many people pick up the arcane archer fighter? How many people become an alchemist artificer? How many people, go into the sorcerer or into the sorcerer list and they're like, yeah, I mean, there's the divine soul, but when's the last time you played a draconic bloodline? It's very basic. People don't think about it, and they're like, well, why not?
Yeah.
And I love doing that. I actually came with all my stuff here prepared to just do an example right here on the interview.
Let's do it now.
Because I wrote down the 3 core fundamentals of a character. You've got their background, their race, and their class. And I wrote them down on these sheets, which literally are just my handwriting of this is all my lists. So I was like, okay, foundation of a character. What are you before your background or your class is your race? And in Xanathar's guide, they have that table that I was talking about here on page 73. You roll a D100 and you just determine what your race is randomly. So I just roll, get myself, that's a high roll, 95. So according to the table in Xanathar's, that makes me a tiefling. So I guess I'm a tiefling now. That's my start. The next thing I would do would be to roll my background, because you're your background before you are your class. That's how you are raised. And I've got there's a big list here of 54 backgrounds, depending on which books I have, and because I don't have them all, but there's endless amounts. But I would like to just go with what's in the player's handbook. So I grab myself a D6 and a D8, because there's 13 backgrounds. This can give me anywhere between 2 and 14. So that makes sense. And I get myself a 13. So that's the second from the last on the list, which makes me a soldier. So I'm a tiefling whose background is soldier. So what's my class? Again, I'm looking at this table here in Xanathar's, a D100. This is everything except artificer. So if you want to do artificer, you'd have to add your own. But here I'm going to roll this. I got a 90, which makes me a warlock. Tiefling warlock. That's not cliche at all. Let's make it work. Now, on this list, there are 9 different warlock subclasses, because warlocks get to pick that at level 1.
Yeah.
So 9. That means I'll roll a d10, re-roll on a 0. See what subclass I'm going to do. 3, great old one.
Okay.
So I'm a Gulak. Now, using those concepts, I'm a soldier, tiefling, warlock. Now I flip to a different spot in Xanathar's where I go into, okay, I'll skip the birth stuff because that one's a little more deep, because that one would be we don't have the time for all of that. But there's a section right here. Why did I become a soldier? So that's a D6 table, real easy. Number 5. I wanted fame and fortune, so I joined a mercenary company. That's how I became a soldier. Wanted fame and fortune. That's why I became a soldier. But then why did I become a warlock? That's also in here. Another D6 table. Number 6. One of my ancestors had a pact with my patron, so that entity was determined to bind me to the same agreement. So family, ancestor, patron bond. This is very much sounding to me. Have you ever watched the anime Berserk?
No, I haven't.
It's one of those ultra violent animes that you have to really be a hardcore blood and guts fan to like. But in it, there's this young man, the main character, who gets picked up by a mercenary company, and they treat him real well. But then the leader of the mercenaries end up sacrificing everyone in the mercenary company to turn them to sell his soul to a demon so he can have superpowers. And this is just kind of reminding me of that. I was a tiefling who wanted to be successful, so I became a soldier and I became a mercenary, But in my demonic bloodline or devil bloodline, somewhere in there was an old deal between like Mephistopheles or Asmodeus or one of them and Cthulhu or one of the other great old one. Like at some point, those two made like a bargain, and my ancestor was in the middle of that. So that ties me both to my tiefling background and to my great old one warlock background. And then this is the part I love, which is the life events table. I don't know if you have Xanathars nearby.
I do. I just haven't been in this section.
Yeah, it's page 69 of Xanathars, the life events section, based on how old you are. So if you assume, which you can also roll for, by the way, how old you roll. My character is, I rolled a 30, so that means I'm between 21 and 30 years old. So I guess I'm 25. That means I had 1d4 life events. 1d4, I rolled a 2. So that means two major life events happened to me during my soldier / into the warlock time frame. You roll on that. 27 tells me that I fell in love and got married at one point. It doesn't tell me how, but it tells me I did. So I was married at one point. So that's important. You roll the other life events. Nope, that's the same thing. So I'm going to roll again. 92. Oh, committed a crime. Okay. Or was wrongfully accused of doing so. So there's another table, which is the crime and punishment table. I roll on these, and my crime that I was accused of was kidnapping. I was accused of kidnapping. And then in punishment, which is the D12 table, I got a 6. I committed the crime or helped do so, but nonetheless, the authorities found me not guilty, got away with it. So my character kidnapped someone and got away with it. Why? What does that have to do with the soldier background? How is that connected to my warlock? What I'm thinking here, and this is just me spitballing. This is me rolling dice. I've not designed this in advance. I'm thinking that I was accepted into the mercenary company. That was my life. Everything was fine. That was going to be my future. I even met another soldier, a female soldier in the mercenary company, and we were doing great things together. Then the whispers of the great old one started to kind of pick at me as I started to like eke into my brain. And I was like, these weird voices are telling me to do things, but I didn't tell anyone about it. And then it started to take over. It started to take control of my character, and I would have blackout moments where I would go somewhere and I wouldn't remember what I had done. But at first it was just little things like, oh, you killed that person on the battlefield a little more viciously than normal. Or, oh, you stole that thing. Why did you do it? And you don't remember doing it. And, you confide in your loved one, like, ooh, I think something's going on. And they try to get you some help, but then because you've confided in someone, it that triggers your warlock powers to show up. That's your level 1 warlock. Now your great old one patron takes over you and makes you go and perform this crime of kidnapping. And you come to with maybe a kidnapped noble or a kidnapped noble's kid or a military leader's family member or something that you're trying to do that. And now you've got them in front of you and you're like, oh God, what did I do? And then your loved one walks in, sees the scene, realizes that you've been doing all this, and they're like, you're shamed, you're kicked out of the mercenary company. But because the mercenaries don't want the stain on their name, they don't turn you into the authorities. Instead, they cover the whole thing up. So soldier background, you've lost your loved one, you've got this weird voice in the back of your head that's telling you to do things, and now all of a sudden at the beginning of the campaign, your character is coming to terms with the fact that now they have this warlock power in them. And there's this weird twist of what do I do? Do I lean into this or do I fight it? But as a warlock character, you're probably going to lean into it. So that's that whole thing. Obviously, I didn't make any of that up. I had the blank character sheets, but that was just purely from rolling. And that was just the bare bone.
That was absolutely fantastic. And that shows that it works really well. I think that's quite inspiring for even the advanced player. So thanks for demonstrating that.
Yeah, and obviously there's more stuff. There's deeper backstories. There's more, obviously the personality traits that are in the backgrounds could all be randomly rolled. So I didn't roll those, but I could flip the player's handbook open and roll for soldier. Who knows what I'd get? And that right there is a unique kind of challenge. It goes beyond turning a role-played character into something on the table or optimizing for a concept. It's neither of those. It's its own thing, and I think it's a really, really challenging and rewarding way to play.
Truly excellent. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and everyone, please go and watch Relaxed Fantasy Review and give him a sub. And I'll see you next time, Daniel.
Yes, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate you.